So I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube regarding picture profiles and using Sony cameras and which ones are the best, like slog3, HLG, or Cine2. And there's even a random one called ITU709. The next time someone asks you which picture profile you use, tell them ITU709. They'll be like, what? So I've decided to get to the bottom of this by using each picture profile 1 through 10 in their factory settings without any customization to see how they look back to back. I went ahead and tested out each picture profile in their factory settings without any customization. I shot them in multiple locations and in different scenarios to make sure by the end of this video you can have a good idea of which profile you like the most. I tested these out in a vlogging style shot, in a horrible lighting situation when the sun was straight above me, a slow motion action shot, a perfect lighting environment in the morning, a controlled lighting environment, and also low light. The goal of this video is not to prove which one is better than another, it's to give you an idea of how each picture profile looks and which profile you should use in whatever scenario you are in. I don't claim to be an expert in picture profiles, but I did figure out the best method for exposing each profile through trial and error. These are just my opinions, but I do highly encourage you to go out and to test these settings out so you can figure out which picture profile you like the best. If I were to define color grading, I would say it's made up of 2 parts. The first part is to try to get the closest true to life color that you can out of your camera, and the second part is adding your own artistic flair, whether it's a LUT or a filter. With that said, what I'm looking for when I'm using picture profiles is blown out skies, skin tones, and dynamic range. Also, whatever one is the most simple and easy to use while getting the greatest picture possible. You can use these methods on any Sony Alpha camera you have and just customize the profiles to however you like them. Because we are only using factory settings, picture profile 10 is HLG2, so that's what we left it at. If you want to see a video on how to shoot, expose, and grade HLG3, I made a video for that and I'll leave it in the description. So the first thing to understand is that every single one of these picture profiles has to be overexposed with the exception of HLG2, which is picture profile 10. I figured out the perfect exposure settings in my opinion for each picture profile, and I'll leave that in the description so that you can have that information. So for example, if I wanted to use picture profile 3, which is ITU709, I would click on my function button, I'd scroll over to picture profiles, click on it, come down to picture profile 3, I would click on that, then I'd come to my ISO, toggle up to auto, click on it, then I'd go back to my function button, click on it, come over to exposure compensation. I would check my reference guide, and for ITU709 picture profile 3, it's set to 0.7. So I would just toggle this up to 0.7, click on it, now I'm set and ready to shoot. I highly recommend turning your exposure compensation on while you're shooting in picture profiles so you're not constantly having to monitor the exposure compensation meter. This will help you nail the proper exposure settings as you're shooting. It's also nice because if you have to turn your ND filter on, you don't have to re-expose your shot. Another good practice is to use zebras because they show you exactly what is being overexposed as long as you have the zebra settings set up right. I'll also leave the proper zebra settings for each one of these picture profiles in the description so that you can make sure that you're always properly exposed. If you don't already have exposure compensation or zebras set up in your function menu, I highly recommend you put them there so you don't have to fumble through your menu system. I'll leave directions in the description on how to put those into your function menu. This is going to be a long description. This video is going to be made up of 2 parts. The first part is going to be the picture profile video tests using these exposure settings. The second part is color grading in Final Cut Pro. So with all that out of the way, before you set your picture profile, make sure you custom white balance your camera. And yes, I will leave that in the description. No picture profile, and I have the exposure compensation set to 0.0. Picture profile 1, exposure compensation 0.3. Picture profile 2, exposure compensation 0.3. Picture profile 3, exposure compensation 0.7. Picture profile 4, exposure compensation 0.7. Picture profile 5, exposure compensation 0.3. Picture profile 6, exposure compensation 0.3. Picture profile 7, exposure compensation 1.3. Picture profile 8, exposure compensation 2.0. Picture profile 9, exposure compensation 2.0. Picture profile 10, exposure compensation 0.0. So right now I have no picture profile and my exposure compensation is set to 0.0. This is picture profile 1 and I have the exposure compensation set to 0.3. This is picture profile 2 and my exposure compensation is set to 0.3. This is picture profile 3 and I have my exposure compensation set to 0.7. This is picture profile 4 and I have my exposure compensation set to 0.7. This is picture profile 5 and I have my exposure compensation set to 0.3. This is picture profile 6 and I have my exposure compensation set to 0.3. Picture profile 7, exposure compensation 1.3. Picture profile 8, exposure compensation 2.0. Picture profile 9, exposure compensation 2.0. Picture profile 10, exposure compensation 0.0. When shooting in the picture profile S-Log, your ISO automatically jumps up to 1000. So in some instances, you may need to turn your ND filter on, even if you're shooting inside, to curb some of that overexposure. Alright guys, so here I am in Final Cut Pro. I've imported 4 different clips, ITU709, Cine2, slog2, and HLG. And I'm going to show you exactly how I color grade each one and little tricks and tips that I've learned along the way. So the first thing that I always do is I click on my first clip inside the timeline and I press Command 7 so that I can get the waveform scope. And if it's down here below your video, I just go ahead and click on View and I uncheck the vertical layout, so now it's on my left side. I'm going to go ahead and minimize the browser so I have a bigger workspace. Now I can take a better look at the waveforms. If you don't see the waveforms, just come up to this little box right here, click on it, and make sure you have waveform checked, Luma, and IRE. Once those are all checked, now we're going to have a good basis of how we're going to color grade. So then I go over to the color palette, I click on it, come down here, get my color wheels. The first thing that I do is I bump down the shadows. Now I want to make sure that these waveforms don't go below 0. So the next thing that I do is I come over to my highlights, and as you can see in this picture, the clouds are pretty overexposed even though my face is exposed. So we're gonna go ahead and bring the highlights down to where they are just below 100. Now I'm gonna go over to the saturation and I'm gonna tap it up. I just wanna make sure that I'm keeping my eye on my skin to make sure I don't turn too red. Then we're gonna go over to color curves and I'm gonna do an S pattern with the Luma. So I'm just gonna bring this over a bit, bring this down. Not too much. This is where my skin tone lies. So I think right about there. And that's it. So let's do a before and after. So I'm gonna go ahead and unclick my color wheels and my color curves. Once I start clicking on those, you can see that the color comes back in the clouds and I get some of that skin color back. And now looking at it a second time, I see that my skin is a little bit too red, so I'm gonna come back to my saturation and I'm just gonna bring it back down. And now we're gonna take a look. That's perfect. All right guys, so there's ITU709. It's a good starter, great dynamic range. Who would have ever thought ITU709 was that good? All right, so now we're at Cine2. As you can see in the waveform, some of the waves have come closer together. That's because we have more dynamic range with Cine2, which gives us more room to play, and we don't have any clipping as of yet. So again, we're gonna come up to our color wheels. We're gonna bring down the shadows till we get to 0. The highlights are already just about there. I'm gonna come down to where our highest peaks are underneath 100. Then I'm gonna bring up the saturation. Then I'm gonna come over to my color curves and do the same thing again. I'm keeping my eye on the darks over here because I wanna make sure that I don't drown out the darks. I'm gonna bring up the highlights a little bit over here. One thing that I wanna keep my eye on is those clouds. I wanna make sure that those clouds do not get overexposed. And Cine2 does a great job to where you're able to see the clouds and the foreground without any overexposure. So now we're gonna do a before and after. So kind of washed out, bring the colors back, and then the color wheels. And then what I'll do is I'll go edit the next clip, and then I'll come back to this clip and I'll touch it up again. And I'll just keep doing that until I think it's perfect. All right guys, so now we're at slog 2. Slog is undeniably the hardest picture profile to grade, but we're gonna do the best that we can with the tools that we have. So while I'm in Final Cut Pro, I'm gonna come on up and get my color wheels. Go ahead and bring your shadows down to where they hit the 0. Bring your highlights up to 100, thereabouts. Bring up your saturation. So one thing that I noticed when I am pushing up my saturation in slog 2 is a lot of the blacks turn purple. So the way that you take care of that is you come over to your color wheels, go down to where it says hue saturation curves. Go ahead and click on this little eyedropper where it says hue versus sat. I click on that, then I bring it over to the video and I'll just click it over a black portion and it shows me where it is on the hue versus sat graph. Go ahead and drag it down and it just removes that purple from it. So anytime you have blacks and you have to saturate the heck out of it to bring the colors back, just go ahead and use the hue versus sat eyedropper method. Then I'll come to my color boards. Since we don't have a lot of sky, I'm gonna start bringing up my exposure, but I don't wanna lose those grass blades. So I think I'm gonna go to probably like right around there and maybe even bring up some of the midtones just to make it a little bit brighter. Just like that. See, it kind of like looks like a cinematic commercial. And I know I could probably spend about 10 more minutes trying to perfect this clip right here, but for the sake of time, we're just gonna move on to HLG2, which is Picture Profile 10. All right, Picture Profile 10, HLG. So the first thing that we wanna do is get this picture to the proper coloring so that we have a good base of where to color grade. So the way you do that is you click on your clip, come up to the eye in the inspector, scroll down where it says Color Space Override. If you're not seeing this menu, come down to here where it says Basic, click on it, scroll down to where it says Settings, click on it. Now where it says Color Space Override, click on it and go to Rec 2020. So that gives us a good base. The next thing that I do is I always sharpen HLG footage because it comes out a little bit dull. So the way we do that is we come over to our effects panel, we go search for sharpen, sharpen effect will come up, we go ahead and just drag that into the HLG clip. This sharpens it by 2.5 and that's generally pretty good and that's all I think I'm gonna do for this clip. So now what I'm gonna do is go up to my color wheels. Go ahead and bring my shadows down to 0, predominantly. Highlights up to 100. Saturation. Now HLG footage comes out a little bit saturated, so I recommend going into the custom settings and bringing down some of that saturation. I think I usually do mine to like -7. All right, I got my skin looking pretty good, but the grass is still pretty green, so I wanna take that down a couple notches. So the way that I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna click the down arrow, click a color board, go ahead and click on this circle that has a box surrounding it, add color mask, gives you a little eyedropper. Go ahead and highlight all the green areas until all of the green is highlighted. Now I come to my saturation and I'm just gonna push down the greens. Maybe like that. You know, that looks more real to life. Alright guys, so now you know how to color grade every single picture profile that's in your Sony camera. You can even use these same methods in Premiere as long as you know how to color grade. So I noticed that picture profile 1, movie, and 2, still, were very similar to straight out of camera. Picture profile 3 and 4 ITU709 surprisingly had a really nice, easy, simple, smooth, real-to-life color, and I'm definitely going to continue to use these if I'm in a run and gun situation. Picture profile 5 and 6, Cine1 and 2, are probably my favorite because in my opinion they had the most cinematic look to them and you only had to overexpose them by 0.3. They're super easy to grade and I think that they would work really good in an interview setting or commercial work. Picture profile 7, 8, and 9, slog 2 and 3 are definitely the most difficult to grade. Yes, they deliver a great picture and if you graded them in DaVinci, you could get some pretty high quality picture. But for me, I didn't like the amount of time it took to grade and also constantly being nervous that I'm too overexposed. Picture profile 10 is probably the most impressive and the least amount of work. I did notice some softening around the skin, but that can be fixed in post. If you're shooting a Hollywood movie or a documentary, HLG is the go-to. So I hope this video helped you on your filmmaking journey, answer any questions that you might have had about picture profiles. I know I had a lot of questions going into this video, but now I feel pretty comfortable using all of the picture profiles. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm Joe with Potter Made, and let's grow as we go. Peace.